Hello, everybody. I'm Jenny Smith, and I'm here in Stafford, Virginia this morning, a beautiful fall day, with Ben Spackman, who is joining me from Arizona through the magic of the internet. Isn't it wonderful that we're able to do this?
It's amazing.
It really is fantastic that we can. Last week I was talking to a sister in Cambodia. I've spoken to people in Canada. It's very, very exciting to be able to have this opportunity to reach out to members from all over the world and learn from their experience. Ben is a scholar, an LDS scholar out of Minnesota originally, but after a recent encounter with the cow, we think that he could claim Utah residency. But he's graciously taken time off from writing his dissertation to come and join us today. So I'm going to let Ben introduce himself and tell you a little bit about him.
So I'm a historian with a pretty eclectic background. I did my undergrad and my first 6 years of graduate school in what my wife calls old dead stuff. I did ancient Near Eastern studies, which is basically Old Testament languages and cultures and civilizations. So I studied Hebrew and Aramaic and Assyrian and Babylonian. And along the way, I've also done some science. And the PhD I'm working on right now is American religious history. And so as parts of that, I do American religious history. I do Reformation history with Luther. And the third leg of my chair is history of science. So I'm writing a dissertation right now about creationism and evolution in the Latter-day Saint Church after 1970. And so I kind of straddle ancient Bible, modern American religious history. I taught at BYU for a couple of summers while in grad school, taught Institute for about 14 years, taught seminary a bit, a lot of time at things like the Sperry Symposium and Education Week and the Mormon History Association and the Fair Mormon Conference. So I've been all over.
Well, good. We're excited to have somebody with your caliber and expertise here. So again, you're kind of beating me. I'm a housewife, like I said, living on a farm. So we're glad to have somebody who actually knows some stuff talk to us. Ben and I have been chatting for the last 25 or 30 minutes about where we'd kind of like this discussion to go. And he said that he'd like to start by teaching us something about how the manuals are created and how understanding how the manuals, what perspective the people who are writing them church manuals are coming from, how that can help inform us as seminary teachers, how to better prepare and prepare lessons for our students.
So I wrote a post about this recently with some information from the archives that I've been researching in. But back in the 1950s and 60s, as the church started exploding outside of the Utah corridor, outside of the United States, and as correlation started being established and kind of standardizing things, there was a real concern to make sure that manuals were accessible to new converts. And so in this post, I have a letter from a curriculum writer who wrote manuals in the 60s. And they were told that their manuals should be written at the level that a 3-week convert could teach out of them. And a couple years ago, as I was doing some work at BYU, we had someone from the church office building come talk to us. And they said that church materials, that is the ensign, the manuals, gospel doctrine, they are aimed at the global church and the average member. And statistically, that means someone with about an 8th grade education who's been a convert for less than 5 years. And so in this archival thing I found, this curriculum writer who was writing several decades after they'd produced these 3-week manuals, as he called them, he said, well, one of the problems that this created for us was that today we have several generations of adults raised on those 3-week manuals who think the manual is the defining boundary of orthodoxy and adult mature knowledge, and beyond that, thou shalt not go. And I think when you understand how the manuals are written and who they are written for, it should give us a lot more freedom to do what the manual actually says in the front, where it says you should know your class and adapt to the needs of your class. That may mean adapting down. That may mean adapting up. But I think a seminary class full of fifth generation Latter-day Saints whose parents are college educated is going to be a very different class than, I don't know, a class of all converts in Japan, where it's not even a country with a Christian background. They may not know any of those basics, and their parents certainly weren't teaching them the gospel at home. So knowing how the manuals have come to us, who they are written for, and so on, I think should help us feel some freedom to adapt to the needs of our class and serve their needs, as opposed to kind of making the manual an idol and following it blindly.
Good. I think that's a really great observation. And I think that one of the key parts of teaching seminary is knowing your students, even within a classroom where you think you've got fifth generation members of the church. Even on an individual level, each of those students is going to have a different level of understanding about the gospel, and we've got to be able to adapt and be able to teach those students on whatever level they are. So it does require some getting to know your students.
Yeah.
We're not going to spend a lot of time talking about how to get to know your students in this podcast, or in this webinar. Maybe in another time we'll do that.
People are not my area of specialty.
Not so much. We're not going to cover that today. But speaking of students, one of the things that makes teaching teenagers particularly difficult is that they're in this transition place between their primary understanding and the primary stories that they've heard to adult understanding of the scriptures. And so one of the things we're going to talk about today, and I'm going to toss it over to Ben to start speaking on this subject, is understanding where the manual is. How can we help students who are ready to start preparing for that level of adult complexity? I'm not saying that we're going to, and you're going to talk about this too, but we're not talking about pushing complexity on students, but laying the groundwork so that students can be better prepared when they meet some complexity in life, because they will. And I think we're hearing more and more stories about people who discover something new. They find out Joseph Smith is a polygamist. They're disturbed by different aspects of church history or even of our doctrines. And they're unable to wrap their heads around the complexity that is in our scriptures and in our work, because the manuals have been geared at this lower level. So how can, let's start talking about that. How can we lay the groundwork to help students move to complexity?
Well, so first, I think as teachers, we need to be aware of that complexity ourselves. You know, we need to be well informed and reading broadly. And there are some things from President Hinckley and others that I've posted in the seminary group about it's imperative that we as teachers in seminary read constantly the scriptures, but we also ought to be reading secular history, the great literature of the ages, the writings of contemporary thinkers and doers. In doing so, we will find inspiration to pass on to our students who will need all the balanced strength, and I love that term, balanced strength, that they can get as they face the world into which they move. So we as adults need to be not just narrowly, preaching the manual, but we need to be deeply in our scriptures. We need to be deeply in our church history. We need to be deep in contemporary thinkers as much as this is possible, because, we all have jobs and lives and families and things, and seminary requires a lot of prep. But with seminary students, oftentimes there's no room, either intellectual or in terms of time, to actually get into complexity in class. And so what we have to do instead is just make them aware that what we're teaching is an introduction. It's a basic idea. It's a 102 level, and there is more complexity out there. There is more information than this, but these are the basics that we need to know, and that's why we're focusing on this in class. When I was in high school, I had, at the time, a really frustrating experience that I now tell all the time. but I was in AP Physics, and what we spent the first 6 weeks on was talking about different models of the atom. And so we started with atoms are just little balls. And we all knew that was wrong. And we said, well, isn't that wrong? And he said, yeah, we'll talk about that next chapter. Well, we got into the next chapter and he said, okay, the next model is atoms are this central ball with other balls going around it. And we said, well, doesn't that create problems with, and he said, yeah, we'll talk about that next chapter. And in the next chapter, we started talking about how these aren't actually solid balls. These are kind of probabilities. And this is how that responds to those previous questions. And we said, well, what about blah, blah? And he said, and we all started reciting in unison, next chapter. That is, we learned very quickly that what we were being presented with was kind of a simplified model, because you have to start with a simplified model, and there are going to be questions that can be addressed with a more complex model. And so even though we didn't necessarily understand the more complex models, he taught us to expect them, to expect changes in our level and degree of knowledge. And I don't think the physics translates directly into the seminary, or how it maps onto Book of Mormon versus doing the Gospels or whatnot. But a lot of our spiritual experience as adults and our spiritual life and testimony is based on what we have been taught to expect. And people who are taught to expect that there is no complexity tend to really, really struggle when that complexity is forced upon them.
Well, when we do that, right? We say the gospel is simple, right? A 3-week-old convert can teach these lessons, right? A young child can understand this. And so we have kind of created that problem. So in the seminary classroom, we need to be prepared to help students move beyond that.
How do we create that expectation that there is more complexity? And so sometimes when people tell me the gospel is simple, I will agree. And I'll say the gospel is simple, but scripture, history, and doctrine aren't. Those aren't, that Venn diagram overlaps, but not entirely. So, and I think the manuals are changing, the gospel topics essays and the Joseph Smith papers are being integrated into our D&C and church history stuff. I hope to see those kinds of changes also come into how we teach the Old Testament and New Testament and things like that. But basically, we need to create the expectation there is more to know. It's more complex than this. And for me, I love that. It really throws people, and I confess I sometimes enjoy the shock value a little. But I tell people my favorite standard work is the Old Testament, because it has those layers like an onion, and it has questions for me that as I dig in, I am rewarded in what I learn, and it helps create a basis for understanding all of our other scriptures that are based on the Old Testament. Book of Mormon is Old Testament based, New Testament is Old Testament based. And it's a challenge, but it's a challenge that pays off. I mean, there's no growth without struggle. So if you're avoiding struggle, you're not going to grow.
For sure.
And so I love the Old Testament because it does provide those layers, those questions, that complexity. And, that's not what I'm going to do with a 9th grader necessarily. Mm-hmm. But I do want to create that expectation that it's there, that complexity is not a bad thing, that there is this world to be explored that is rich and rewarding and enlightening and constructive. I worry sometimes that we bore people in our classes by too much simplistic repetition, but that's getting off base a little bit.
I don't know. I think boredom is always a perennial problem in seminary. I think that's something that we, there's got to be something that keeps a kid awake and that keeps them coming to Sunday school every Sunday when we repeat these same 4 books that those kids have been repeating since age 8.
Yeah.
So there is an opportunity for us to up our game a little bit, to step out and start embracing some of this complexity, because that really is, I was a design major, so God is in the details, right? Let's see if we can find some God in these details that are in the scriptures.
Yeah.
We've talked a little bit about what should be covered in class. I'm wondering, we talked a little bit before about the trajectory that can be set in seminary, that can set people off course. Can you expound on that a little bit?
Yeah. This goes back a little bit to that question of expectations, which is a general thing. If someone goes through a seminary class and they are taught that everything is static, that everything is known, that prophets mean we have the answers to all the questions, that it's all simple, and then they're going to struggle when they're on their missions. And they're going to struggle more when they're 25 or they're 40. Sometimes what happens is there is a disconnect between how we teach the gospel and how we teach scripture. And we focus so much on the principles of the gospel that we end up overlooking details in scripture that are important. And we sometimes use the phrase, well, that's not necessary for salvation. And to take one blunt example, I think of various people I have known who have gotten to their 30s or 40s who discover at that point that Joseph Smith was a polygamist. And they never learned that in seminary. They never learned that on their mission. They never learned that through gospel doctrine or manuals or books or something. And that throws them for such a loop. It undermines their testimony and their trust. And so understanding the fact Joseph Smith was a polygamist is certainly not necessary for salvation. But not being aware of that complexity, that scriptural truth out of D&C 132, that can set people up for spiritual failure later on in life or as a missionary when they have, and I don't give any names here, but I'm sure this story has played out multiple times. If you learn something from someone antagonistic on your mission and you say, well, that's not true, or I would have known about it. And then you learn that it is true and you go, well, why didn't seminary ever talk about this? Mm-hmm. And, that might be Joseph Smith translating with the seer stone in the hat or various other things that may be closer or further out on the fringes or more central in the gospel. But we have to teach in class both the gospel and the scriptures. And we have to look long-term with our students because with the age change, they are going out on missions almost immediately. Mm-hmm. Maybe they'll get a year of college in, maybe a year of institute, hopefully with a good teacher who will help them on their own spiritual journey to maturity. But also, for the 25, 30, 40-year-old, and we do not want that person to be a bishop or stake president and have kind of this very rigid mindset and then suddenly be thrown for a loop by Joseph Smith and the seer stone and polygamy.
Good. And I think this is a really important thing to talk about in the seminary classroom. But it's important to point out that in the seminary classroom, there simply isn't time.
Yeah.
And the level of student is not always capable of understanding all the adult level complexity that you and I might understand or someone else might understand. And that's okay. But I think for the teacher who's looking for specific ways that they can prepare a student for getting ready for this level of complexity, I'm thinking back to when I taught seminary, and I would intentionally ask questions that were difficult or ask questions that were hard or let the students struggle a little bit in class. And then we would demonstrate how to look on the internet and find an answer, right?
Yeah.
We talk about why doesn't this have an answer? Or why are there different viewpoints? And is it okay to have different viewpoints? I loved your example about when you were teaching. Was it at BYU you were teaching where you introduced the two contradictory things?
Yeah,
I think that is something key we can do in seminary.
I've written that. There's a link to that story I can give, but I taught a return missionary section of Book of Mormon at BYU back in 2004. And one of the things I did was when we came to Mulek, is I assigned two contradictory readings by equally authoritative people. And one of those was by an LDS archaeologist who says, has the seal of Mulek been found? And there's this Israelite seal with the name MLK, son of the king, if I remember correctly, that's been published. And then I had them read Orson Scott Card, who wrote an article about the Book of Mormon. He said, I'm a fiction writer. If I were writing the Book of Mormon as fiction, here's where I would have messed up. And he writes about how in history, as people compete for power, they often will fake their genealogy to prove that they're the ones who are supposed to be king. And so his take on Mulek, and he has a good argument for this, is Mulek is an invention of the king of Zarahemla as to why he should be king, but Mosiah has records and language and other things. And so Mosiah becomes king of this people, even though he's coming in to their place instead of the king of Zarahemla.
Right.
And so my students were forced to read Mulek, historical invention, which completely fits within the Book of Mormon. I mean, Mormon, the editor, knows nothing about this, but what's on the plates, right? He's 1,000 years removed from this, 800 years or so. Or Mulek, real guy, and we found his seal over in the Middle East. And this is too much for seminary, but forcing them to read these two views, some of them came in and they said, well, who's right? This was the very black and white, rigid mindset that truth gets dictated from the top down and we don't have to think about stuff. We just have to go out there and find the authoritative answer. And I said, well, I don't know. They both make very good arguments. Why do you think I assigned these readings today? And they were very puzzled by it. And I said, most of your adult life, both in the church and out of the church, will be spent trying to reconcile competing information, undigested information, uncorrelated information. And you have to learn how to reason through it, how to evaluate it, how to look at different sources, how to say what makes sense, what has a good basis, what does the Spirit tell me, what is consistent with Scripture and teaching. And some of them absolutely loved that. And some of them, I think, walked out going, I don't understand what just happened. But so with seminary, I think the way I would do that is something like what you did, where I will basically bring in something that is not central at all, but I will say, you know, we have two presidents of the church who had very different views on this topic. And that says to them, I should expect to find different views in church history on things, even from people who are prophets and presidents of the church. Not everything is revealed. It creates space to expect diversity of thought, even on scriptural or doctrinal questions, and that they'll have to kind of wrestle through that.
I think this is so key, and I think this really is an area where seminary teachers can make a difference in the lives of their students that will carry forward for 40 years. This groundwork, this expectation, or understanding that some questions can't be answered, that you're not, that church leaders can have differing ideas and it's still okay.
Yeah.
One of the questions that I used to ask my students too when I was teaching was, what changes as a result of this doctrine? And I know you have
what's at stake here?
Right,
yeah.
Right. Why are you so spun up about this particular topic? What's your personal feeling about this? Because sometimes there's very personal reasons why somebody's very connected or very interested in a certain topic. And we can get into that in class. That helps build your rapport with the student and helps you understand, be able to adapt to them. But I liked your example about the tree, where you talked about how do we determine what is a core piece of what we're learning about and what isn't so much important.
Yeah, so this comes from a handout I used at BYU in my classes, where I relate kind of the totality of church history and scripture and doctrine to a tree. And the trunk of the tree are those very few things that are very well established and unchanging. Jesus is the Son of God and the Messiah. God sends prophets to testify, and so on. And so when students ask a question, instead of responding first, I will often follow up with a question. I'll say something like, well, why is this question important to you? Because if it's just curiosity, we may not want to spend 5 minutes on it. Come see me after class or something. Right. But I might say, where on our tree metaphor does this question land? Is this something on the trunk? Is this something on one of the thick main branches? Is this way the heck out on a tiny branch on a leaf that is shaking and maybe falling off? Things about Kolob or the three Nephites, or oftentimes when we get into Moses or the Old Testament, we'll get, well, is this the Son or the Father speaking? I think, what is the relevance of this question? What's at stake here? Is anything really at stake here? Why does it matter? And once we can realize that these questions are more out on the branches as opposed to closer to the trunk, we're generally better able to move past them even without giving an answer. Or oftentimes the answer that I do give is, well, there's no revelation on that, and different general authorities have had different views. Some of them held strongly, and I can give you those references, but there you go.
And I think it's okay. At least I hope it's okay, because this is what I did when I taught. I would tell students, there's no revelation on this. What do you think? And let them express their ideas and express that it's okay to wonder about these things and to think about them, but to understand that we don't have a right or wrong about every question. I think that's okay. And another technique I would use when a student, a lot of times we would get into a discussion and a student would have a question that I could go really deep on. And so it's difficult sometimes to know how deep to go. Yeah. And so the question that I would ask as a teacher is, how long have you been wondering about this? Because if a student comes to class and it just occurs to them during the course of discussion, my answer is going to be different than someone who's been struggling with this question for months and months.
Yeah.
And so I'm wondering, we also talked a little bit about how do you change directions when a student kind of gets off on one of those three Nephite type discussions? What kind of advice can you give us there, Ben?
Well, especially if other students start chiming in. I mean, as a teacher, you're kind of torn when all of a sudden students get active and they're talking about stuff, but they're talking about stuff that's completely irrelevant and, far from central. And so I'm sometimes overly blunt, and I say, that's an interesting rabbit trail, but it's not really important. And so if it's important to you, come talk to me after and we'll talk about it. But I feel like it's more important for us to stay on the trunk of the tree and our scriptural stuff today. It really depends on the student, though. I mean, some kids really fixate on their random question, and some will kind of go, oh, okay, yeah, I understand that we have limited time and we need to focus.
Well, and like you said earlier, there are a lot of people who get spun up on a question and it spins them right out of the church. Yeah. And so I think keeping a perspective, I like your tree analogy there, that keeping perspective on what, is this one of those floppy leaves out there, or is this a core trunk issue?
And following up, occasionally what happens is someone will have a question that they perceive as central.
Okay, good.
And that may flow from bad assumptions or misunderstandings of history, or like their entire testimony is floating on, I always thought Joseph Smith was 6'4", but he's 5'8". And so sometimes it's better to actually pull away from the content of the question and get into the framework or the basis for that question and say, what is the relevance of Joseph Smith's height to the truth of the gospel? Or, if Joseph Smith is really only 4'3", does that mean we don't have prophets and Jesus isn't the Messiah and the Book of Mormon is false? One of the things that I spend a lot of time So my wife and I have both been ward missionaries. And, missionaries, they're often straight out of seminary, but all of a sudden they are extremely motivated to read their scriptures, to ask questions, and they're getting exposed to all this stuff because they're teaching a huge variety of people. And so I spend a lot of time talking to missionaries and trying to answer their questions and reorient them. But oftentimes it is the most productive thing is not, here's my question, and I say, well, here's your data. It's to step back and look at the assumptions around the question, the framework around the question. For example, I've talked about this on a podcast. Missionaries in America who are talking to Protestants end up talking about grace versus works. And they've kind of been taught, or they pick up along the way, that when they cite Romans or Ephesians at us, we counter by citing James. Mm-hmm. And when I talk about grace versus works with missionaries, instead of saying, yeah, here's some more scriptures to prove that we need works, instead I try to sit them down because, this is over dinner, we've got 15 or 20 minutes. It's not a seminary situation, but I'll say, look, here's why Protestants understand grace this way. Good. And here's what it means in the New Testament. Paul didn't invent grace. He didn't invent the terms he's using. He's drawing on Greco-Roman context because there was this thing called the patron-client relationship. Most people were very poor and helpless. When you had a problem you couldn't solve, you'd go to someone wealthy and powerful. You would enter into this personal relationship. And because of that relationship, they would do this thing for you that you couldn't do for yourself. And what the patron did for the client, that was called grace. And what the client owed the patron in return gets translated as faith. It's not mere mental assent. It's not mere belief. It is loyalty. It is allegiance. It is willing to speak well of that person. It is willing to do what they ask you. And if you go back to these passages that tend to get quoted at Mormons and you plug in allegiance instead of grace, if you plug in allegiance instead of faith, like I think it's Ephesians 2:8, and you plug in a circumlocution for grace, for it is by God's divine patron goodness that you are saved, and this through allegiance. And for them, it totally reorients their approach to this. They may not be able to preach that to other people, but they're going to be much less threatened talking to evangelicals who are huge on being saved by grace and attacking Mormons because they think we believe in saving ourselves by works. So if you can step back from a question and try to see what the basis is for that question, what the assumptions are that are hidden, that are driving them to ask that question, that is sometimes far more useful long-term than simply providing data or even saying they're different views on that question.
And I think that's another thing, another technique that we can teach in seminary too, is the way of understanding, taking the time during a lesson to ask questions and find out why someone thinks that way. Like you're saying, why is this important to you? Yeah. What's the understanding? What's the background? And create an expectation that we can do that whenever someone asks a question, that we don't just automatically vomit an answer out, but we try to understand the context where that question is coming from.
Well, and you said the C word, which is my favorite, context. One of the things that the manuals kind of blur and that hasn't often been clear in the church is that there are at least two kinds of interpretation. I mean, there's way more than that, but there's contextual interpretation, like in the Gospels. We want to understand, in Matthew 24, how did Matthew's immediate audience understand that in their day, in Greek, in their context? And then there's a second interpretation. What does that mean for us today? And there's contextual and there's non-contextual, and those can be fairly different things, often because our situation is very different than theirs. Mm-hmm. But if you can teach students how do you research context? A lot of times those questions can be answered by looking to context. And that's something I try to model. That's something I try to contribute in the seminary group on Facebook.
Well, that's something that's missing in our manuals. It's missing in Come Follow Me completely.
Yeah.
It's missing in our seminary manuals to a great extent.
I mean, they do say look to context. Context is important, but they don't provide a lot of guidance as to where to find that context, and they don't provide a lot of that context directly. The Institute manuals do provide some of that. And I know the new Institute manual is pretty decent. The Old Testament Institute manual is still from 1980. I've done some work on that. It is very hit and miss. And sometimes when it's wrong, it's very, very dangerously wrong. And I know there have been 2 attempts to rewrite it that got scrapped, and they're working on another one right now. And I don't know those details, but be cautious with the contextual data from the Old Testament Institute manual.
I'm proud to hear scholars say that, because I'm a footnote reader.
Yeah.
And when I taught out of the Institute manual, when I used the Institute manual as a supplement for seminary, I was like, what in the heck is this?
Yeah.
So yeah, I think, and I don't mean to disparage anything that's coming out of there, because again, we, like you said, even prophets don't always have all the understanding of what a material is, but when there's better information, newer information, let's seek after those things too. And they don't always have to be published by the church. We can look outside of an Institute manual, because there are lots of people studying the Bible besides just us.
Well, and there is so a couple thoughts on that. You've got President Nelson, who recently said that good inspiration comes from good information, which I love. It's pithy and it's so true. Elder Ballard has talked recently about epistemology, which is the technical term for knowledge. How do you know what you know? What is real knowledge? What is knowledge based on? And he says, by nature of my calling as a general authority, there are some things I know and some things I don't know. And when I have questions I don't know, I turn to experts and I ask them. And he singled out, if I remember correctly, biblical studies and ancient history. And so me and my cohort were just cheering at that point, but he said, find experts and ask them questions. And in connection with that, and the Bible especially, there have been some major shifts recently that are kind of invisible to your average person. So first of all, Deseret Book published Thomas Wayman's New Testament, basically study Bible. Which is a huge, huge philosophical change that I could go into. But there have been 3 articles out of Religious Educator, which is a church-approved journal out of BYU's Religious Studies Center that goes to seminary and institute teachers. There was my article a couple years ago on why Bible translations differ, which talks about how to use different translations. Earlier this year, there was an article by Dan McClellan, who works for the Church Bible Translation Committee and has graduate degrees in this field. And what he does in that article is he says, here's why the church, why the worldwide church, why our manuals and why our general conference talks can't just be based on the King James Version. And so he also advocates using other versions and study Bibles. And then just recently, Josh Sears, who is a BYU religion professor with a PhD in Hebrew Bible, he has an article on study Bibles and Latter-day Saints, where he runs through them, what they are, how to use them, his recommendations. And that just barely came out in print. It's not available electronically yet. But I think between that Deseret Book publication and these 3 Religious Educator articles, I think seminary and institute teachers should really be getting the idea there is good information out there that is not contained within Deseret Book, that is not necessarily by LDS scholars, that we can profit from and learn from, and we should. And there are some guides to that, and it's fantastic.
people who've assessed that stuff. I mean, it's nice to have a, a friendly face that has assessed some of that information. I know speaking again from a technique standpoint, a seminary teacher can introduce students to the idea that there are other translations. That Joseph Smith's translation was not necessarily the word of God coming straight to him. That in some cases he's just clarifying the text. It's not necessarily, I think we imagine a translation process like we imagine the Book of Mormon process. That it's different. I used to always ask my students, give me the Jenny Smith translation. Translate this into your own words, make it so it makes sense to you. Just to give them the idea that these words are not set in stone some way, that they can't be, and they're not perfectly communicative. I'm wondering, my battery on my laptop is protesting.
Okay.
So I'm wondering if in the next maybe 4 or 5 minutes, what kind of information would you consider essential to share with a seminary teacher, maybe based on your experience? Maybe one of the questions I usually ask is, what's your best experience teaching? What's your worst experience teaching? What did you learn from those? Is that something you could share?
I think my best experience teaching that comes to mind instantly isn't actually a seminary group. Mm-hmm. But it was actually presenting some of this stuff about grace and patron-client to a whole bunch of mature adults at Education Week. Mm-hmm. And I know there were a number of, I know there was a temple president in there, a couple mission presidents, some former, church leaders, 50s and 60s, and they had never heard any of this stuff. And it was revolutionary to them. And, I learned that stuff by reading non-LDS material. And by dint of my training and my interests, I think I'm one of these people who helps bridge and filter and bring this material in. But you don't have to be dependent on someone like me to find it, because it's out there in very mainstream scholarship that would be in a study Bible like recommended by Josh Sears. And the other thing about this teaching experience, I mean, there were literal gasps at this reorientation around what grace meant for Paul, right? And it had not occurred to me that this was such a huge jump in understanding for them. But it's not like I was teaching them secrets about Kolob. This understanding grace and the New Testament is a pretty central part of the gospel. It's something that we deal with sin and atonement. So this was accessible material that they had never heard, that I got from non-LDS stuff that was pretty close to the core of the tree. Mm-hmm. It's not like this non-LDS material is going to be all weird data on the outside about Paul or slavery or, Hebrew grammar or whatever. Some of this stuff can be very central to our core concepts about covenants and atonement and grace and things. So there is so much good to be gleaned there from people who have dedicated their lives to studying the gospel and the Bible, who are outside the church. And that's accessible if you know where to look. I mean, not all material is of equal value. That's true of church material as well. There have been books authored by general authorities and LDS scholars that are absolute garbage, and I won't name any, but it's certainly true.
Thank you for doing that.
And similarly, there are things written outside the LDS church that are absolute garbage that I would hate to have people read. And so it is useful to get into Religious Educator and look at the footnotes and see what authors and books are being cited, like N.T. Wright or Peter Enns or John Walton or Amy Jill Levine. I get really excited talking about this stuff because my own spiritual journey has just involved so many positive, faith-promoting, edifying experiences of learning something new and central about Jesus from this non-LDS material. And so when I get into a class, whether it's gospel doctrine or seminary or something, and I see people rehashing, the word of wisdom for the 17th time in their life, I think this could be so amazing.
Mm-hmm.
And
well, I think that's key.
anyway.
I think having the attitude that the gospel is amazing is a key part of enthusiasm with teaching, that that there is more to learn always. And I also think I love what you said about seeking for knowledge from other sources, because isn't that one of our basic premises of our faith, right? If there's anything virtuous, lovely, of good report, or praiseworthy, we seek after these things, and we want to reach out and connect with our faithful brothers and sisters in other religions who are not who are also worshiping Jesus Christ, and who have deep insights into his nature and his works and his divinity.
And oh, there we go. I guess we're done. Thanks for joining us. And maybe there will be more later.